Hi, I'm Katie from Rabbit Leader Sewing Patterns, and this is a video tutorial for the Readers, Sunnies and More pattern. You can find a link to the pattern in the description below. Oh, and this is a really fun pattern to sew. It's super quick and a scrap buster. Readers, Sunnies and More are simple slip cases designed to protect your glasses. It'll either fit easily into a purse or into the breast pocket. There are 7 different designs in total. We have 5 raw edge ones, beginning with the classic Readers pattern. Then there's the Readers for your reading glasses with space for a pen. That's great if you like doing crosswords or you commute, that sort of thing. Then we have 3 different Sunnies patterns. The regular Sunnies will hold small to medium sunglasses, and the other one is slightly larger and will hold your medium to large sunglasses. And then alongside those is quite a generously sized Reader's puzzle pen. Says who doesn't like sitting in a deck chair and doing the odd puzzle. Now if you prefer to use woven fabric, then we have these 2 versions here. So we have this one with a very pretty binding, which is actually very easy to sew, and I talk you through that in the video. Or if that really isn't your thing, then we have this one here, which has no binding at all. So whichever one you choose, I know you're going to have a really good time sewing it. You can learn some skills, practice sewing your curves for instance, and as I said, it's just really quick and easy and great fun. So let's get started. So here we have pattern pieces A, Readers, the classic, and pattern piece, this is actually double D, but D is the same. Those are the sunglasses ones, the Sunnies. Different sizes and shapes, but we're going to make them in exactly the same way. The first thing to do is to mark them up. So, with the classic Readers, you want to make a little mark for the label. If you're not using a label, obviously just skip this bit. And that one is going to be 1.5 inches up on that right hand edge. For the Sunnies, I've made the mark 1 3/4 inches up, just because it's a little bit longer in size. Put that one aside. The next mark that we want to make is where the 2 pieces join. So where that short edge meets the longer edge. When we come to do sewing, we're going to pause there so that we can actually fold this over. To attach the label, get a little piece of double-sided tape and put that right on the very edge. If you heard a funny noise then, that'll be the doggy again. So get your label, and if it's a folded label like this, just set it back very slightly from the edge and then fold it over and take that part of the label all the way to the edge. Just secure it in place, and if you've got a clip handy, which I don't, you can just clip it in place like that. I'm just going to show you one other thing before we start sewing. Sometimes with cork you get a certain amount of fraying around the edges. You can probably see that there. With this particular one, that's because I used a piece that was literally just big enough, so the machine didn't really cope with it very well at the edges. Anyone with a scan and cut or a Cricut will know you have to leave a little bit of a margin around the piece you're cutting. So a good way to get rid of that is just to use a lighter. So you can just run that along there. Try not to set fire to it, and I think you should be able to see the difference there. Our Reader's Classic case is ready to sew. Such a fun little pattern this, because it's just so quick. And if you've got a cutting machine as well, you can cut several out and make heaps for presents or wedding favours or anything like that. It's very relaxing. Great one to sew when you've got some downtime or a couple of days off or whatever. So the first thing we're going to do is to start sewing from here. Now you have got a choice. If you want to match the colour of your lining, then put that colour thread into your needle. So in this case I would have black thread threaded through my needle and this greeny blue colour threaded in the bobbin. I'm going to do this as a contrast, and doing it as a contrast does enable you to sew continuously without having to actually stop and change the thread. But I'll tell you when you would do that. So the first thing I'm going to do is pull up my bobbin thread. It's easy enough to do. Just pull it up like that. It doesn't give you a generous amount on this machine to get hold of, but we got there. You do want to make sure your bobbin thread is pulled up and that you're holding both threads when you start sewing. You are going to see this front and you don't want a big bird's nest there. Okay, so we're lined up, nicely ready to sew. I've got a mark on my foot here, which is actually this little gap in it. This is a satin stitch foot. I find it very good for these patterns. And I've got a stitch length of 4, which I think is nice, gives a nice top stitch effect. And we're just going to start sewing, and we're going to stop when we get to this mark over here. A couple of stitches forward. Just take your time, enjoy the process. When I get to the corner, I like to just lift the foot slightly. I've got a knee lift, so you probably won't see the foot lifting so much. And you can turn the fabric. And that way you get a smoother stitch line going around your curves. Come down to that mark. And then stop just before it with the needle down. Now, if you've used a thread that's matching your lining at this point, and your lining isn't the same colour as the outside of your case, like we've got here, you do need to backstitch here, change the thread in your needle, reposition your needle exactly in the same line of stitching, and we're ready to go. We're just going to trim off these threads. And we're going to fold this over. Match up your corners, your bottom, your side. There's a couple of clips to hold it together. It is worth taking the time to get it nicely matched up, because it's a couple of seconds more here, but you're going to be looking at it forever. I probably said that somewhere else as well, but it's true. So when we come forward, we're just going to go back and forth over the edge for a couple of stitches, just to make sure that there's a little bit of extra strength there. So that one's just landed in. So I'll go one stitch further, I'll go back 2, and then I'll come forward again. And I can just carry on down. When you get to the label, an awl is handy to hold that down. So make sure it doesn't get flipped over. Again, you can just, if you need to just tweak it over slightly at that point, you can. Again, taking the corners nice and slowly will get you a much nicer result. Once you've sewn a few, you can actually start turning it, because you get an idea of how quickly to turn. When you get to the end, just backstitch. And that's you done. Trim my threads. And there's your little reader's case, or your Sunnies case, depending on which one you made. So this is pattern B, which is the reader's woven fabric with the binding. We have two pieces here. They've both got medium weight fusible interfacing on them, and the lining has also got a bit of fleece that I cut the seam allowance of. That doesn't need to be too precise, it works fine. So the first thing that we're going to do is actually just put these together, line them up nicely, so you've got it nice and neat, and then just take it to your machine and you're going to stitch it with a basting stitch at a scant 1/8 of an inch all the way round, just literally putting these wrong sides together and stitching it together. Right, marking up. Again, we'll put a little mark where the label wants to go. And once again, that's going to be 1.5 inches up from the bottom. A bit of chalk for that one. We're also going to mark the middle at the bottom, so the centre bottom. So the best way to do that is just fold it in half. Do apologise for the plaster on my thumb, I managed to skin it. So just fold it in half like that and make a mark there. Just something that you can see. And the other thing we're going to do, of course, is fold it over like this, match it up, and just make a mark on the inside where that short edge meets the long edge. We're ready to start attaching the binding. So we've got the 1/2 inch binding here, which means it's 1/2 inch wide. I folded it in half and pressed it, and at this end I put a little bit of fray check on as well. That's where we're actually going to end up. I've actually put a little mark on there, if you can see it, just 2 or 3 millimeters, just less than 1/8 of an inch in from the edge, and I'm going to line that mark up with the centre mark that we made on the bottom of the bag. As you can see, I put a little bit of double-sided tape, or DST as you get to call it after a while. I've clipped the corners slightly just to help it go around, and this, it's not necessary, but it does make it a little bit easier. So we'll just peel off that first bit. So take your binding, and don't put your fingers on double-sided tape, Katie, and we're just going to line that mark up with the centre line that we made on the bottom of the case. Just press that down. When you get to the corner, just to encourage it to go round, you can put a few very small snips into the edge here. Don't want to go very far, but it just helps it a little bit. And then you can just ease it around. Try and get it as close to the edge and as well lined up as you can. Once you've gone around the corner, you can peel back the next bit. And continue around. And we're actually going to do that all the way around to there, and that's where we're going to stop. So I've now got my binding attached all the way around. I've added a few clips, obviously, just for security. And the next thing we want to do is just trim it. So fold that binding over as if it was finished, and then you can just trim that off flush to the edge. That's going to make it tuck in nicely when we come around to sewing, which we'll go and do now. We're ready to attach the binding to our woven reader's case. If you remember, we made a mark on the tape earlier, which matches up with the centre mark on the case, and that's where we're going to insert our needle and start sewing from. Don't start at the edge, start from that mark. So we'll get that lined up, and we're sewing at 1/4 of an inch seam allowance at this point. So I'm just going to hold the threads and get that in nicely. I need to come over a bit. There we go. And you want a relatively short stitch length. I use about 2.6, 2.8. And off we go. We're going to sew all the way around, and we just sew until we get to the very end of the binding. When you get to the corners, just smooth out the tape as you go, so that you're always sewing on a smooth bit. That way you won't get any rucks in the binding. Sew a bit, smooth it out. Can be a little bit fiddly. I'm also going to as you'll see, an awl comes in very handy here. So our binding's now attached. First thing to do is flip it over, have a look at it, make sure it looks fairly even. I think that looks pretty good. And then we're going to start clipping it. You're only just going to be clipping this top edge. Make sure again that you can see where your mark is before you start sewing. I might just have to make that one a little bit longer. And you're going to start folding it over just until it meets that stitch line that you sewed earlier. Just fractionally past it. And put a clip on. And you're just going to carry on clipping around until you get to that mark, and then we'll start sewing. So I've got my binding clipped on. I've been checking that it looks about the same amount on the front and the back, and then we're going to start sewing again at this edge here. Put it on the machine, and we're going to sew very close to the edge. Okay, so we got to the mark here. Now what we're going to be doing next is folding this over. So first off, you can see that even though we trimmed this earlier, it's actually stretched a bit, so we'll just trim that excess off there. Handily take the thread off at the same time. It is possible to just keep it in the machine and fold the binding over the top, but it is very fiddly, so unless you're an expert with binding, I really recommend just back stitching a couple of stitches and actually removing your piece from the machine. Now we're going to fold over the rest of the binding. So start with the corner and just match that up as best you can. A little clip on there. And so you can see I'm peeling it back and I'm actually clipping the case without the binding rolled over the top at the minute. I'm going to slide that underneath. That's a little bit fiddly. Check that it's lined up. And at that point I will fold that over, and I'll just clip that for now. Probably come back to that in a minute. Now we can come back down to here. Just get rid of that little end there. Fold your binding over. Again, just to the stitch line, or just over the stitch line. You want to be just over the stitch line. Obviously match your end up nicely. Fold the corner over. Pop it in. Middle. So when you get to the middle, this is where you can start doing it properly. Just check that those side edges are actually meeting up. Fold your binding over the label, and again just over the stitch line. Come back here and just check that that hasn't moved. It's moved a little bit. Just moving that over. That in place. As you go, keep flipping it over just to check. What you don't want is a lot more on this side than that side, because otherwise when you stitch you'll find you're stitching off on the back. So just constantly checking as you go. So although I said take it over the stitch line, don't take it too far over the stitch line. Now we're ready to carry on sewing. I've got both the threads again because obviously you will see the back, so you don't want a bird's nest there. And I just have to take this out. I'll just pull him down a little bit. Mr. Wonderclip. Have you ever wondered why they're called Wonderclips? I think it's because you can't find them and you go, I wonder where they are. And then sometimes you just find a random one and you say, I wonder how that got there. Anyway, I dive. Here we go. So I'm starting exactly in the stitch line that I was sewing before, and on some machines again you might need a hump jumper just to get over that bit there. Come forward and stitch fairly close to the edge but not right on the edge, because as I said you don't want it coming off the end, the binding on the other side. Someone told me my binding looked quite neat the other day. I felt very proud. I haven't done much binding, so if I can manage it, I'm sure you can. I actually find this one easier than the next one I'm going to show you, which is the woven with no binding. Because you have to be so accurate on your stitching on the corners on that one. I actually find the waistbands on things like skirts and trousers where you have to fold that over and stitch through, that never seems to go quite right. Back stitch at the end, and there we go. I can clip now. Lovely sound. So we just got a little bit of trimming to do of our threads. We'll turn it over, and we can see it's, you know, it's going to vary a little bit, but that's absolutely fine. So I do recommend that you just hand stitch that end together. It's very hard to get that under the machine, so it's better off with a little bit of hand stitching. Isn't that cute? Here we've got our pieces for pattern piece C, which is the woven fabric again, but with no binding this time. So again, we're going to want to put them this time right sides together. Get rid of that bit of thread. And we're going to, it's easier on a lot of machines to sew on that side rather than on the fleece side. So I'm going to show you that. So the first thing you want to do is get your ruler, and you want to mark a gap on this bottom bit, roughly 4 inches apart, because you're going to need to leave a turning gap. So we'll just make marks like that. Then take it to your machine, and you're going to stitch at 1/4 inch all the way round from that mark all the way round, stopping at that mark there. And you can, as you can probably see here, you can actually mark where you're going to be sewing. So I've actually drawn a line at 1/4 inch all the way around. I sew this, and I find it actually slightly harder than the one with binding, because I sew what looks like beautiful curved corners, and when I come to match it up, and I'm like, could have been better. So I reckon this is the best chance that I got. So yeah, I've been sewing quite a long time now. Sometimes I still go for the easy route. So with this one, my thread is just a general all-purpose thread, and I am going to sew with just a universal needle, and quite a small stitch length, about 2.8 maybe, 2.6, and we're just going to sew from this mark here all the way round to that mark there, and that's where we're stopping. Then I'm going to change to a basting stitch, and I'm going to stitch across to where I started. So here we go. And with the line there, you can actually follow it in the middle of the foot, which is quite nice too. You haven't got to worry so much about your well, you still have to worry about your corners obviously, but not about what distance your foot is from the edge and all of that. When you get to the corner here, we're just going to pivot around. So I've got to the end and I'm stopping by that mark that we made. I should have said earlier, when you get to these marks, just make sure that you backstitch, I've already gone over it a couple of times, really well, because you're going to be turning it and you don't want it to come apart at that point. That's very frustrating. So now we're going to turn the stitch up to a basting stitch of 5, and we're going to carry on sewing across that gap. Stop at the other end, and I am not sure how much I went backstitch there, so I'm going to go back down at my stitch length, come forward again, and just reinforce. You see, so if you do forget, you've got the possibility of redoing it, which is fantastic. Okay, so let's take that out, and we're ready to proceed with the next step. So the bag has been stitched from this mark here all the way round to that mark there, back stitched really thoroughly either side of the mark. So if you haven't done that, go back, do that now. And then I closed the gap using a basting stitch. I'm going to press the seam open, which will make it easier to close that gap up later on. So I've got my little line here. It's a little bit tricky getting around the camera, but we'll see what we can do. Press that open, press it back on the other side. Doesn't need to be perfect, every little bit helps really. We're just pressing it against that basting stitch. Now that I've pressed that, we just need to trim the corners a bit. So just use pinking shears and just trim quite close to your stitching, but obviously not right up to it, and do not trim this bit here. You can also trim across this corner here. So just go all the way round. Until you've got all your curves trimmed. So using your pinking shears, that's what it should look like. And now we're going to undo those basting stitches and turn the bag. I've turned the case out. I like to use a bone folder, but a sculpting tool or even a chopstick work just fine. I've given it a really good press, and as you can see, I've basted the gap closed using a large stitch right on the edge, because you want to be able to get those out easily afterwards. So the next thing to do is mark up our piece. I'm going to fold it in half, just like we did with the readers, and make a mark where the two edges meet. If you're using a label, again, just like the classic readers, you make a little bit of a mark. This is black, so I'm using a bit of white chalk. 1.5 inches up on that right hand side, and then you can attach your label. I used a little bit of double-sided tape and just put the label on top of that. You can refer back to the reader's video if you want to see how to do that. We have our readers woven, no binding, ready to sew. Labels clipped on. We're going to start sewing at this shorter edge here, and I'm using a slightly shorter stitch length than I normally do for top stitching, just because on this one where you've got the double edges, I think you get a nice result on the corner, but it's up to you. You can stay with the same long one if you want to. So we're just going to line that up nicely there, and we'll start sewing. And we're just going to sew all the way round and stop when we get to this mark here. So we've got our woven readers ready to go. We've got the label attached. I've got my needle inserted at the top of the short edge, and we're going to top stitch all the way around and stop at this mark here. I've got a slightly shorter stitch length, only fractionally shorter, just because I find it's easier to sew around these tiny little curves when you've got that extra layer underneath. I have done the back stitching, so we're just coming forward nice and slowly and watching that mark. I'm just going to do the whole lift the foot slightly, turn the bag to get a nice curve there. And come down to the mark. Because I'm using the same colour thread in the bobbin and the needle, I don't have to actually backstitch. So now I'm going to turn this over. First cut those threads off that we've got hanging here. I always like to match up that bottom corner first, and the sides and the bottom. Click that. Use your presser foot to hold it in place at the top. And I'll just put one more on the side. There. Now, you might want to use a hump jumper at this point. Let me just see if I've got one here. If you haven't got one, you can also use a needle case. Maybe that's a good thing to show you. You can just put your needle case in underneath. That one's actually a little bit too big. So I thought I'd go and find both for you. So this is a hump jumper. It has a thicker end and a thinner end. In this instance we don't need the thin end. So a needle case actually does really well as well. Just pop it in under the foot behind the needle, and it's just going to raise the foot. So instead of having to sew up a hill, your foot just thinks it's walking on the flat basically. And we just carry on sewing forward from there. When you get to the label, I always like to hold it down. If it does flip over, normally you can turn it back again. Just check your corners lined up before you get there. And then just keep sewing to the end. And there we have it. Your case is finished. So this is Reader's The Crossword Master, and when we finish this one you're going to have space for the glasses but also space on this side for a pen. So we'll start off exactly the same as the others. Again, just making a mark where they meet, just there. And then again for your label, on this one again it's 1 3/4 inches up. So we'll just mark that. Like that. So we've made our mark, and there I've put a little bit of double-sided tape, and then take the label, just set it next to the mark and about 1 millimetre in from the edge, and then fold the top over, and that wants to line up exactly with the edge. So leaving that little gap just allows it to adhere to that. And just put a little clip on to hold it in place. So this is pattern E, which is the Reader's Crossword Master, and when we finish this there will be a little slot for the pen. The Sunnies puzzle pen piece, which is F, pattern F, you make in exactly the same way. There's just one slight difference with how you sew the slot for the pen, and I'll explain that when we get there. But the first thing we want to do is to actually just sew the case together, and we're going to start at this corner. I've got my top stitching thread in the machine, and I've got both my threads here which I'm going to hold, And just line this up with a foot, and we're going to sew all the way round until we get to the mark here, and then we're going to pause. This one's got some quite sharp bends in it, so I'm just going to take it a bit more slowly. If you see it speed up, it's not because I've become bionic, it's because I've worked out how to do it in the video editing. If it doesn't speed up, you know I haven't worked out how to do that yet. In which case you're just going to have to suffer until I do. If you can hear any strange noises in the background, I think it's my dog. He's snuck in. It's very hot here today in New Zealand, and I have very, very lucky to have a heat pump in my room, which at the moment is pumping out nice cool air, so he's just probably enjoying that. Apologies to those of you who are in the middle of winter, but you know, we have our moments here too. We do get winters. Okay, so we're stopping at that mark, and I'm just going to trim off these little ends here. Actually went over the edge there, which I don't really like, but anyway. Fold it over and line up the bottom and the bottom corner. Another clip here. Sorry, I'm a bit pedantic about this because it's one of those things that you can do it now, or you can look at it forever and go, why did I not take the time to do that? Okay, now we're good to go. So we're going to go over the edge. If you've watched the other videos, you'll have seen this before. Back again, and then forward again, and then we're just going to sew down. Again, when we get to that label, use your awl just to hold it down. Lift the foot, turn the piece of fabric. That way you get a nice smooth curve. And so all the way to the end. Trim that. Okay, so now we're going to take this away and we're going to mark on our pen slot, which we'll then sew after that. Here we have our crossword master ready to mark up for the pen slot, and also our Sunnies puzzle pen. You can see the size and shape are quite different because obviously your sunglasses are a lot larger. So we'll start off with the crossword master, and they're both marked slightly differently. For the purposes of this, I'm going to use some blue chalk. However, I would not recommend necessarily that you do that because it can actually stain, but at least you'll be able to see where I'm doing the mark, which is the main thing. So 1 inch in from the edge all the way along. There you can see, nice mark there. Okay, so with your Sunnies puzzle pen, there's not a lot of difference, but there is a little bit of difference. And the difference is that at the bottom edge, you only want to be 3/4 of an inch in. You're probably wondering why. You could do it at 1 inch, to be honest, but I just found that actually it looks nicer when it's finished. So the top is 1 inch. So you've got your 2 marks, one at 1 inch, one at 3/4 of an inch, and all you have to do is to draw them, join them together. There we go. And then we can just take those away and sew them. So we're back at the machine with our crossword master, and we're going to sew our pen slot. Now you can see what I meant about the blue chalk. It doesn't really look that nice. It's actually quite hard to get it off some of the cork. So I actually recommend that you use a heat erasable pen in a colour as close to the thread that you're using as possible, and that way, even if it does fade a little bit after you've ironed it to remove it, you're probably not going to see it under the stitches anyway, so that's better than this, I think. You could just use pencil, I suppose. So we're going to start sewing at the bottom, and we're going to back stitch a bit, then we're going to come all the way up to the top, back stitch a bit, pivot around, and sew back down over our same line of stitches, and that's going to make sure that this is then strong enough to hold the pen. So we'll just line that up. It's a straight line, so you can actually use the mark on your machine for once. Doesn't seem to happen that often with bag making. I'm just going to lower my needle where I want it to go in, holding onto my threads. And off we go. So a couple of back stitches, and then we can go down. Oh, that didn't sound good. I'm having problems with this machine today. We'll see what happens. I may have to redo this, but we'll find out. So we're going to pivot. And we're going to sew it back down. I'll come forward slowly and see if it will sew. Yep, we're okay. And there we are, done. So our little crossword master, our pen slot is ready. I like to just give it a little bit of a squeeze if it's cork, give it some shape, and then when your pen slot's in, which I'll show you in a minute, you will see what it looks like.